This is Chill Bill coming at you live from K-Troll, here to introduce another exciting episode of Skylanders Portalcasters, the podcast discussing anything and everything Skylanders. Over to you, Ditto.
Thank you for the introduction, Chill Bill, and welcome everybody to this Halloween episode of Skylanders Portalcasters, where I am joined by my co-host Trioxen, and today we are going to be discussing the terror that is nightmare difficulty in the Skylanders franchise. How do you feel about this topic today, Trioxen? You ready to discuss?
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to discussing this one because as a more casual player of video games in general, I haven't really delved too much into higher difficulties in video games, especially Skylanders. So it was only more recently I actually tried Nightmare Mode for the first time in all the games that have it. So I have a lot of thoughts, and I'm excited to get into it.
Great to hear. Before we dive too deeply into the topic, for any listeners who may not already know, Nightmare difficulty is the highest difficulty available in 5 out of 6 of the Skylanders games. Spyro's Adventure didn't have difficulty settings, hence only 5 out of 6, and it's known for being quite the challenge. It also has the requirement most of the time of having beaten the game to unlock this difficulty, so it's definitely not meant for a player who hasn't experienced the story yet. Trioxen, why don't you give us an overview of your experiences in Nightmare Mode as you progressed through the series a little bit?
Sure thing. I went chronologically through the games and pretty much played them all back to back over a series of days. So starting with Giants, I was initially taken aback because kind of an overarching concern with some of the games was that I went to my original save file and went to level select, but couldn't change the difficulty to Nightmare Mode from my original save file. And so I actually had to look it up online and find out that, oh, you actually have to start a new save file, which is fine in some respects, but I like being able to switch the difficulty throughout different levels. So if I'm struggling with one level, I can always try another one, or so on and so forth. So that minor hiccup aside, I jumped into a new save file, and I found that in Skylanders Giants, for introducing a new nightmare difficulty, it eased you in initially really well. I didn't really have much issue with the first several levels. They did feel, of course, more challenging than regular difficulty or even hard difficulty, but it still I didn't feel like I was breaking out in a sweat or I was really like having that rush of adrenaline or anything like that. But then I got about as far as Willikin Village, and that's when I started to feel, okay, like this might actually be heating up a bit more. But that is unfortunately where I end up putting down the game so I can move on. But Ditto, you've mentioned to me that Giants actually picks up in difficulty right after that point.
Yes, actually. My experience with Skylanders Giants, now granted, I didn't play the games in Nightmare difficulty in chronological order, especially seeing as how I didn't play the games initially in chronological order. Nightmare difficulty was something I went back to tackle later on with the intent of 100% completing everything that the game had to offer in Nightmare difficulty. Now, you've mentioned that Giants required you to have a completely different save file that was specifically, exclusively Nightmare difficulty, and that is something that I've noticed that is a running theme amongst all the Toys for Bob titles, except Spyro's Adventure, which didn't have difficulty settings. All the Toys for Bob games require a separate save file for Nightmare difficulty, whereas the Vicarious Visions games allow you to change your difficulty freely. Now, in regards to what you were saying about Giants easing you in and getting you kind of ready for Nightmare difficulty, I can agree with that 100%. That was a very similar experience to my own. Even trying to complete the levels, the first several chapters of the game, they felt harder. They felt to be a challenge, but they weren't anything to really agonize over. But then about the point in time where it hits Willikin Village, that is where the difficulty starts to spike. And then in the very next chapter at Troll Home Security, it really begins to show that spike. And it just stays at that elevated difficulty from there. I went from being able to gain that 100% completion in a stage in a few attempts, probably about 20 to 30 minutes for the stage, including an extra run for the speed run, to finding it extremely difficult to even get through the stage period because of the requirement of not letting any of your Skylanders faint, and most of the enemies are one-shotting me at the point in the game of aerial attack. And Giants had some interesting balancing issues, whereas in Spyro's Adventure, you could rely on a ranged Skylander to do the majority of the heavy lifting for you, and pretty much carry you through everything the game had to offer. Giants seems to be the opposite, where the ranged characters, while they are very good at doing ranged damage and trying to stay away from attacks, they're all glass cannons. They all go down really, really quickly, and your best bet tends to lean more towards the melee characters in this game. But in Nightmare difficulty, they also tend to go down rather easily and quickly as well, so...
In general, I feel like all my Skylanders were glass cannons in this case.
Right.
So I will probably have to actually go back and into Giants and go a little further to really get some of that intense difficulty that you described, just to get the full experience. But for now, I don't have actually much of a input on that as I didn't play it, so I can just jump right over into Swap Force, which was a very different experience from Giants for me, because immediately I was being punished, it felt like. Swap Force was already like a different game for me because being made by Vicarious Visions, it flipped some of what Toys for Bob already did in terms of how characters worked or how they felt. My always go-to example is Prison Break, being that he's a tank and really powerful and Spyro's Adventure and Giants, and then he is completely useless almost in Swap Force. So already jumping into a game that's going to feel different from how I'm generally like to play these games, having that sudden increase in difficulty was, I had a rough time. The first level, of course, can get through that, no biggie, but after that, and even trying some challenge arenas, I was going through my small supply of Skylanders like I was chugging pop. It was just one after the other, down, 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 and then I pretty much had nobody left to use. In short, my experience with Swap Force, it's the Nightmare mode. I give credit to people who can play through, but for a casual video game enjoyer, it's really hard to try and enjoy the experience when you're wiping out your entire army of Skylanders, and it's just hard to enjoy a game where it's already beating you down that fast.
Definitely hear where you're coming from on that front. Well, Nightmare Mode in Giants really emphasized the lack of balance in the game. The same can be said for Swap Force. I found Nightmare difficulty there to be extremely unbalanced, and it was even worse from the perspective of trying to 100% the game in Nightmare difficulty, because every one of the boss stages in Swap Force has one of their 3-star requirements as take no damage. And trying to do so in a mode where each of the minions summoned cannot be swiftly dealt with definitely changes the way the game plays there. Because even the first boss, where you're dealing with the evil-eyed Glumshanks, it brings in a small Archean enemy known as the Archean Knuckle Duster. And when you're playing in a lower difficulty setting, you usually just pick them off really quickly and really easily, and don't have to worry about them ever even taking a shot at you. But in Nightmare difficulty, they become a valid threat that will haunt your nightmares and have you pulling your hair out in frustration trying not to get hit. The one thing that Swap Force did have that made Nightmare mode a little more bearable was platforming. The ability to jump to dodge attacks definitely made it a little more doable. And if you happen to have a Skylander who could knock enemies off of ledges and things like that, that definitely also made the journey a little bit easier. But nothing at all was going to help with those boss scenarios, where you're not allowed to get hit even one time before clearing it. That just was absolutely wild. That was a decision, and it certainly took away from the fun of the experience. I can also see where you're coming from with the whole it's hard to have fun when your army is just being wiped out. Yes. Trying to get through most of these boss battles without taking even a smidgen of damage. Definitely, I have experienced that. It's frustrating, it gets to be not fun, and there's definitely more enjoyment to be had elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. And I will say, like, my hand-eye coordination isn't the best. So, like, if your eye-to-thumb connection is, like, on point, I think this could be a really good experience, but mine isn't. And I also will add, I did actually have a lot of fun with my last holdout Skylander, who happened to be Dunebug, because with Dunebug's ability to ring out people really easily with his ball ability, and also his flying attack that causes the sparks to shoot up from behind him to kind of provide a little bit of defense. He was actually really fun to navigate like large enemy scenarios where you're just kind of quickly flying between enemies and who are coming too close, but they still take a little damage, and then you're shooting his little dune balls out everywhere. Like that was actually probably the most fun I had with it, with this game. So I feel like a lot of it depends on the Skylander that fits right for you in that situation. And Dunebug for sure was it for me in this case.
I definitely hear where you're coming from with that. Ring out is definitely one of the things that made Nightmare difficulty in Swap Force a lot more bearable. I myself ran through a lot of it with Magna Charge, and he has the ability to just pick up an enemy and then throw them off the edge into oblivion. And oftentimes that was like a saving grace. The other thing is, like you mentioned, and this is going to be a running theme throughout the rest of the series from here, the ability to evade enemy attacks while still dealing damage yourself. As you learn and perfect that ability, that's really what's going to get you through Nightmare in not only Swap Force, but each game going forward from here. And that was really what set it apart from Giant's Nightmare difficulty, where it was just absolutely brutal to the point of it being manageable, is because this skill is there and able to be learned. But then moving into Skylanders Trap Team, where the jumping mechanic was refined a little bit more, and the developers found balance within the game when it came to balancing their characters, that skill that you learned in Swap Force, being able to dodge and still deal damage, now carries over to this new adventure and makes it a lot more manageable, a lot more easily doable than it would otherwise have been.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you there, because I feel like in my experience, Trap Team was where everything hit its stride with the Nightmare mode.
I definitely agree with you on that one. Trap Team is the game which we credited earlier in this series as the one that managed to get balancing correct for the first time. It's also the game that really fine-tuned the ability to jump and mastering the use of the platforming. In this case, it's also the game where Nightmare mode found its balance, walking the line between challenging and fair.
Challenging yet fair is a really good way to put it for Trap Team, because when I jumped into it, again, we have the issue where I wasn't able to take my old save file and switch it to Nightmare mode and jump into any level I wished. So, unfortunately, I didn't have that much experience diving through the story mode in Nightmare mode. I was able to get through the first initial levels, and they were fine. They're the intro levels, right? So you're not going to deal with that much of a challenge. But you have access to the Chaos Doom challenge right from the get-go. So I thought, hey, what a better place to test Nightmare mode than the Doom mode? Essentially, double your Nightmare, right?
Yeah.
I gotta tell you, that was so much fun. I actually had a lot of fun with this one, because previously in other difficulties, I had a rhythm. I figured out which Skylanders I was using for what, and basically, yeah, I had it almost down to a T of like how I got through each of the challenges. With Nightmare mode, I was on the edge of my seat, scrambling with my MVP Skylander, trying to keep everything controlled. But of course, enemies were coming through the cracks, and pretty soon would be swarmed. But there was always felt like a way that I could get back. I could get everything under some form of manageable mess. So even if the big treasure chest box at the end explodes and the enemy comes out, I could switch over to a little bit of a faster Skylander, evade, attack, and get that all under control. Go back to my MVP and try and rein everything in again. I did suffer a lot of losses of Skylanders, as well as a lot of the chests and the turrets, but I was always able to manage to reach the end, even if I was hanging on to one hit point. So honestly, Nightmare Mode with Chaos Doom Challenge is a very exhilarating experience. And the only thing I wish was that they would change the recommended Skylander level for the stages right from the get-go. Because I think with the first ones, the levels, I think it's 1 to 3 or 3 to 5 or something like that. Those guys won't cut it for those first few ones even.
Did you happen to get far enough into the story mode in Nightmare difficulty to face down the first boss, Chompy Mage?
I did not, unfortunately.
One of the biggest things I hear in regards to Nightmare difficulty and Trap Team is that the boss battles are unfair, especially the Chaos final boss battle, because Chaos has an attack which will one-shot nearly any Skylander. But I also found the boss battles in this game to be extremely fair as well for what they were. The bosses definitely did a lot more damage in Nightmare difficulty than you would expect them to. And it gets pretty dangerous and stressful even at times, especially during some of the later boss fights. But I found that those skills that I learned to hone back in Swap Force, the ability to dodge and reading your opponents and making sure you focus on dodging everything, actually really helps you pull through in this game. And if you happen to have a trap, or rather a villain in a trap, that you can switch to in a pinch, like if you notice you're not quite going to make it out of range of this attack and you can do a quick swap, that could actually really, really potentially save you in this game. I did also experience the Chaos Doom Challenge in Nightmare difficulty, and as Trioxen was detailing, it's actually a ton of fun. I've always enjoyed the Chaos Doom Challenge on any difficulty, but Nightmare added really an extra hint of spicy to the mix that just made it almost perfect. Trap Team really is where they found the balance between challenging and fair, and really Nightmare difficulty got to hit its stride there. Now, the skills that we learned in Swap Force and really perfected in Trap Team, being able to dodge and still deal damage at the same time, is a skill that we would continue to develop moving into Superchargers, though the bosses, for the most part, wouldn't pose as big a direct threat to our Skylanders. The challenge kind of shifts a little bit in this next game. Trioxen, do you want to detail a little bit about your adventure in Superchargers?
So my experience with Superchargers was kind of funny because I was honestly expecting something that was almost like, okay, Trap Team hit its stride here, so maybe we're going to see more of that. And we do, for sure. But it was almost like the initial levels were more gradual, to me anyways, like the Giants levels. There was an extra challenge, of course, but it wasn't ever an extraordinary jump or anything like that. The vehicle sections didn't really feel like there was a huge shift in difficulty. But this is also me saying, playing this game, being able to jump between levels rather than having to progressively go through the levels chronologically. The middle sections felt like an actual, like, really good difficulty for me. Like, it was challenging 100%, but it was still felt, to me, fair, and like you could work through it as long as you just played smart. And then I decided to jump to the last level where I felt eviscerated. Eviscerated is a very good word for it, just right out the gate. Just having still that same amount of enemies, but just the damage sponges that they become and the damage they deal out, and myself not being quick enough to necessarily navigate everything that's going on. Quite a few of my favorite Skylanders were blown away in the initial part, and I just had to take a moment and realize what kind of mess I'd gotten myself into.
Yeah, we definitely see a bit of a difficulty spike. As you said, the game seems to ease you into it, especially in the on-foot sections. The vehicle sections also have sort of a gradient here, where you can see the curve and the spike happen. But the game starts you off easing you into the nightmare difficulty, and it doesn't seem like it's that big of a challenge. And I'm not sure if it's the fact that we were bringing over skills learned from previous games, or that the balancing kind of eased up on the challenge side of it. But it definitely doesn't stay that way, because as the game progresses, those difficulty spikes become more and more severe. Superchargers doesn't suffer the same difficulty range with the bosses, and this is where I refer back to what I said before about the difficulty having shifted a little bit, and that's because most of the boss battles in this game are not on-foot bosses, so you're not facing them directly with your Skylander. Rather, you're taking them on with your vehicles, and your Skylander just provides hit points for it. The strategies behind defeating the bosses remain the same, but you have to play a lot more defensively and a lot more evasively in order to do it without losing a handful of Skylanders along the way. Granted, from a completion perspective, Superchargers didn't ever require you to beat any stage at all without suffering any losses. It never had any special requirements, actually. The only thing that the game required for the completion stars was that you do the land, air, and sea vehicle sections. Which, as I said, the difficulty level on those very much spikes. Especially towards the end game, where in Superchargers, the final chapter, you have 2 final bosses to face. Because Chaos himself is not the final boss in this game, he is a final boss. But after Chaos, you have one more challenge left to deal with. Now, the boss fight against Chaos is very manageable as long as you are able to pay attention to what he's doing and you memorize his patterns, and you get fairly good at dodging based on those patterns. You can manage to get through Chaos without ever taking a hit. The same can probably be said of the boss fight against the Darkness, but my vehicle skill level is not on par with my Skylanders skill level. I can platform and dodge like crazy with a Skylander. Vehicles are a little bit more difficult, especially since, once again, you don't have the platforming plane in a land vehicle. You have your X-axis, and that's pretty much it. So I found myself, even using a defensive vehicle that allowed me to shield from taking damage, I found myself handling that boss fight by continuing to use the same vehicle after my Skylander was defeated, and just put another Skylander in to pilot it, so that I still had access to that shield, but my health was greatly suffering from it, and then any damage I would take outside of that shield pretty much took out a Skylander in one go. So I went through a small army just trying to defeat the Darkness boss fight, because my strat was to use and to rely on that shield.
It's so interesting how it's just everything that we learn at this point up to this game and this franchise just does not necessarily work out as soon as you introduce the vehicles. You have 2 games in one, and on extreme difficulty, that could be incredibly challenging for someone someone could be more into vehicle or racing games, or someone could be more into platformers, and it just not necessarily both. So it's just everyone's going to have an almost split difference on this game of how they manage nightmare mode. And that's quite fascinating to me.
Right. It's really interesting with this game because, as I said, you carry over a lot of the skills we learned in the earlier games, especially what with platforming and whatnot and trying not to take damage. You carry a lot of that over into Superchargers, but it's only effective through about half the game. The other half, as you've said, is a completely different game. It's something that you really can't have gained experience in outside of this specific scenario. And that makes for quite the interesting challenge. So, while it seems like in some ways the challenge is lesser in Superchargers, and the balance is tipped a little bit there, at the same time, the vehicle sections then seem to be a little bit more on the challenging side, and so a balance is still struck. It's just not quite the same balance we had in Trap Team, where we both agree that the difficulty hit its stride. This particular game still had a balance, it just wasn't the same balance. And therefore, the challenge was still there, but just a little bit different than one would have expected.
And honestly, I do like that for this game because as much as I would have loved more of the same from Trap Team, just, if it was just Trap Team 2 with the Nightmare difficulty, I would have been content. But to have that, like, extra little spice, the little je ne sais quoi, that wasn't entirely expected, but was very much welcomed, it just creates more flavor for the entire game instead of just being another Trap Team or another sequel, etc.
Yeah, it allowed Superchargers to feel just a little bit different from the rest of the franchise. And each game thus far has been really good about just feeling a little bit different than its predecessor. And it works really well in this series. But this particular flavor was a very interesting one to have added, and not in a bad way.
No, it was a very tasty flavor.
And then the challenge shifts just a little bit once again as Nightmare difficulty really comes to a head, sort of, in Skylanders Imaginators, where it felt a lot more like what Trap Team did, but once again with a little bit of a twist that added a new flavor to it.
Yeah, Imaginators was an interesting one for me. And I say this because with my collection, I don't have really many Imaginators or Sensei characters to play with. So already working with more of a supply of nerfed Skylanders from throughout the franchise in this one, they're sort of facing already that initial difficulty curve, just not from Nightmare mode.
Right, and that's one of the flavors they kind of threw in there that really made the adventure interesting here, because as we've discussed before in this podcast, the previous Skylanders, they weren't exactly nerfed, but they definitely felt it, because the Sensei Skylanders were just built statistically so much more powerfully than anything we had in the past. So even the Eon's Elite Skylanders really didn't stand up by comparison to them. And if you don't have a large collection of Senseis or creation crystals to help you get through this game, especially in the higher difficulties like Nightmare, it really makes you draw upon those skills that we've been discussing this entire time so far. The skills we've been practicing since all the way back in Swap Force. The trying to just basically take as little damage, take as few hits as possible, that really becomes the emphasis of the journey if you're using older characters. And that added a really, really interesting choice of flavor to the game, because, well, that was a choice, and a lot of players weren't happy with that choice. But it certainly made for a very interesting challenge when trying to clear Nightmare difficulty.
Yeah, it really, I would say it's a lot about perspective in a way, because I mean, there is a downside to looking at like my older Skylanders are the ones I, leveled up and enjoyed for these past games. They're having a harder time. That's not what I necessarily want. Or you guys would be like, well, here's like Nightmare Mode Plus if I'm working with like Spyro's Adventure Skylanders or anything like that. But yeah, I will say that in my playthrough, I did do my best to try and play as many of my collection of Skylanders as I could, but I kept always gravitating more to my Golden Queen and my Fire Imaginator, the one that comes in the starter pack, because I built a very fast character that it was able to navigate situations really well, I found.
Right, and that being said, that's another point that needs to be brought up about Nightmare difficulty in this particular game, is the amount of additional or lesser challenge you can experience. You basically get to select your level of challenge based on how widespread your collection is. If you don't have a lot of the Imaginators or the Sensei characters, you're probably going to experience a lot higher level of difficulty because you're using most likely more of the older characters that don't have the boosted stats, and therefore you're going to have that higher level of challenge that way. Or if you have access to a bunch of the senseis and imaginators, especially taking note that the imaginators do not cap out at level 20. They go well into their 50s, and I believe even 60s, if you have all of them, including the chase variants, that is. And therefore, if you have access to all of those, you have the opportunity to lessen the difficulty of Nightmare difficulty on yourself by using one of those imaginators, especially something like, say, a fire quick shot, to just lessen the challenge there. I myself tried to maintain a balance. I tried to use some of the newer characters and some of the older characters, and tried to keep some semblance of balance between them so I could really truly experience the difficulty levels here. But if your collection is large enough and encompasses enough of the Sensei and Imaginator characters, the temptation is definitely there to lean more towards those to get through it just a little bit easier. And when it came down to the final boss fight, that's not to say anything of the boss fights leading up to it, but the final boss fight itself, with Skylanders from Superchargers and earlier, the boss fight was challenging but fair. It almost felt like a trap team level of balance there, unless you brought in senseis, which tipped the scales a little bit in your favor. But if you brought in imaginators, especially high-powered imaginators, the balance not only shifts in that case, but the boss fight itself becomes rather easy. Especially if you've been honing those skills, you can get through that chaos fight without ever taking a point of damage.
That's pretty incredible, actually.
Yeah, and then your imaginators are dealing massive damage themselves. And it's almost like you're back in hard difficulty, as opposed to Nightmare. It can be said of any game, Swap Force and beyond, that if you hone your skills enough, you can get through any boss, you can get through the entire game, without taking a single point of damage. But as with the easier difficulties, this is further emphasized in games like Imaginators, where if you're using a high-powered Imaginator, you're defeating your enemy so much quicker so they have less chances to try to get you to take damage. And so in order to experience the same level of difficulty in Nightmare mode for Imaginators, you definitely would want to restrict yourself to Superchargers and older characters. That is if you want the greatest challenge you can have.
And just to even say that there is essentially a customizable difficulty or customizable Nightmare mode in that final game that is really, to me, a selling point almost to it. Just you can have the most highest of nightmares of difficulties, or you can just have an easier experience, or you can just have that confidence knowing that if you're playing with a Superchargers or earlier Skylander, if you ever need to tone it down just a bit, the difficulty, you can always switch to one of your higher powered Imaginators or a Sensei just to give you like a little bit of a cushion just to get through whatever difficulty you're facing at that time.
Right. And that makes even more sense when you look at the rewards for doing Nightmare difficulty. Giants offered a hat that was locked behind clearing Nightmare difficulty. Swap Force and Trap Team also had a hat locked behind Nightmare difficulty. Superchargers really didn't have any reward for doing it. The reward was just the fact that you cleared it. And then Imaginators locked a full build set, a full Imaginators set behind the Nightmare difficulty. The Wasteland Warrior set could not be accessed until you had beaten Nightmare difficulty on a separate save file, because just like any of the other Toys for Bob games, you couldn't just change your save file to Nightmare mode, or back from Nightmare difficulty to an easier difficulty. You had to play it separately. And I feel like the greatest rewards for beating Nightmare mode were from Imaginators, where you get a full set for clearing the game. And because the reward is so much better than the rewards had been previously, also feels more fair with the ability to select your level of difficulty within the Nightmare difficulty itself. Because if you're a more casual player who just wants the Wasteland Warrior set, You can go through with just high-powered Imaginators and kind of muscle your way through to get it. Or if you're a player seeking a higher level of challenge from it, you could always just go through with characters from games prior to Imaginators and use only those, and you would get the most challenge out of it. And then that Wasteland Warrior set would feel all the more rewarding to you if that's your style of play. It really allowed for emphasis on your style of play. And I find that to be one of the coolest things about this difficulty.
Yeah, having a full set unlocked really does feel like almost a more natural evolution from just getting a hat. And being at Skylanders, finally getting that Wasteland Warrior set and then equipping it to any of your Imaginators, then bringing it over to a friend's house and playing with them or anything, it's your trophy, it's your bragging right, which I feel is more enticing than just a regular old hat in the games. The hat feels like sort of more just like, here's a ribbon, good for you, in my mind. Whereas a whole set feels like, this is so cool, I have this cool armor that really shows how much I've progressed. And we see this in video games all the time, right? Like anyone who gets to the end of a season pass or beats the high, whatever difficulty to unlock a coveted digital item, they're showing it off in game all the time. So this feels like if we had more games after Imaginators, this would have been a really cool way to see that progress for completing higher difficulties in these games.
I definitely feel like the pattern would have held, and future games down the line would have continued to have larger rewards than just a hat as the reward for clearing Nightmare difficulty, because Nightmare is a challenge. It's the highest level of challenge Skylanders has to offer. Granted, we've talked about how in some of the earlier games in the series, specifically Giants and Swap Force, Nightmare difficulty is absolutely brutal. It will frustrate you, it'll stress you out, it will haunt you, and then your reward for it is just a simple hat, which, yes, you can show it off, but it doesn't feel like the reward for the grand adventure you just had. Whereas something that changes the entire appearance of your Skylander, like a full Imaginator set, does. So I could see the trend continuing on, especially with how Toys for Bob was planning on doing essentially more with Imaginators in the next game. They were going to expand on the customization features, etc. I could definitely see them going the same route with the reward for Nightmare difficulty there. And yet, at the same time, because in this specific game, Nightmare difficulty has a range of difficulties depending on how you want to do it. If you're just somebody trying to complete the collection, if you've completed the game in normal mode and all you're missing is that Wasteland Warrior set, as long as you have, and this is the issue with Skylanders all around, is everything is based around the size of your collection. And the price for entry is typically very high in this franchise. But if you had been keeping up with it, or if you have a somewhat large collection, especially including creation crystals, if all you wanted to do was clear Nightmare mode real quick to get that Wasteland Warrior set, it's not so far-fetched as to say you could do so, because one or two high-powered Imaginators would make it feel more like hard difficulty. But accessibility, just like with any other Skylanders games, relies on how much money you were willing to put into the game.
I couldn't have said that better myself, honestly. Especially these days when we're working with secondhand markets and it's hard to acquire, especially with an Imaginator's case, some of those characters and creation crystals for reasonable prices.
Right, which is honestly what confuses me most about the decision to keep the Skylanders completely physical, when the market had already been shifting towards digital content as well, where they could have offered the possibility to not only buy the toy, but they could have also offered the character as an in-game download, paid DLC kind of thing. Each character was basically paid DLC anyway, but it was physical paid DLC, so they could have definitely done it digitally. If you got a copy of Superchargers digitally, and you were using your Trap Team portal, the game offered you a digital Spitfire and a digital Hot Streak to go with it. So they could have easily gone that route with the characters as well, making that an option. But that's not the direction they went with it. Now, if they had gone digitally with it, my point there was that those digital characters could still be accessible now. Imaginators was released on the Switch. You could still have access to the Switch library of Imaginators characters. And then we wouldn't be looking at as much in the way of secondhand markets.
It would have been a really cool path if they had taken it, but that's hindsight for you.
And we can speculate all day on whether or not they would have considered that path for games going forward beyond Imaginators. But in the end, it's just speculation, and that's not information that we would have any knowledge on. Looking back on Nightmare difficulty throughout the entire series from Giants forwards, what would you do to improve Nightmare difficulty throughout the franchise?
Well, being that we're looking back, consistency would have been a big thing across the games. But, of course, these were games made by two different studios, sometimes concurrently. So that doesn't really make sense as a wish, but it's overall, like if we were to say revamp these games and do a re-release of all of them, that would be the one thing, a big thing I would ask for. And I would also it'd be cool to see more of that customizable difficulty within Nightmare mode that Imaginators kind of brought forward, kind of choosing the pace of how you want to handle such a difficult mission, essentially.
I definitely agree with you on that. Consistency would be amazing, especially when it comes to the balance of each game, because as we saw, the game started off very unbalanced, and then they kind of found their stride towards the middle of the franchise, and then just shifted in challenge levels from there. So consistency and balance would be an amazing thing to see. But, as you said, they were separate games, done by more than one studio. The consistency couldn't be there then. But looking back in hindsight, it would definitely be a boon. And honestly, I think it would be really cool if each game in the franchise had more of a reward behind it. Imaginators did really well with that. The others, just a hat, didn't really feel like reward enough. Especially in Giants and Swap Force, where the difficulty was so brutal, just getting a hat for finishing it seemed more like an insult than a reward.
Yeah, no, even just like a color palette swap or something like that for your Skylander, that would be even just something a little bit better. I will say also that looking back, if I could change one thing, and I think you might agree with me with this, is to have the goal of not taking a single hit not be a major component of getting all the stars in a level. I would rather that be, if you can manage that, be a little extra bonus or something that's not going to destroy the completion hunters entirely. Have it be something that is not going to emotionally or psychologically harm anybody in their pursuit of it, because I feel like that in itself has created enough nightmares for Skylanders fans.
Absolutely. The brutality of the boss fights in Swap Force with the don't take damage star.
Just eliminate it. Cut it entirely.
Absolutely. In fact, I don't think that should be a requirement for any level in any Skylanders game at all, boss or otherwise, just to make completion a little bit more accessible to anybody who seeks it. As Trioxen said, maybe add in a bonus for accomplishing it. Definitely don't tie it to completion for the game. Additionally, I understand why Toys for Bob locked the Nightmare difficulty to its own save file. It's specifically so that you don't just go to the final chapter and change the difficulty to Nightmare right before the final boss to get the reward. But if I were to change that, I would go the route that Vicarious did and just make all difficulties accessible at all times so you can change the difficulty whenever it suits you. Just because that's a nice accessibility option as well.
Oh, absolutely.
And then you're also not required to go through the game twice in order to accomplish everything. Or, in the case of Swap Force, 4 or 5 times. And that actually added to the brutality of Nightmare difficulty in Swap Force, because I was going for 100% in Nightmare difficulty, which means I had to accomplish everything the game had to offer in Nightmare difficulty. Which means that from the story mode, the time attack mode, and the score mode on their own, not including the initial playthrough to unlock Nightmare difficulty, I was required to play through the storyline, the full storyline, no less than 3 times in Nightmare difficulty to get all of the stars that I needed.
So Swap Force could be the hardest game in the franchise, but not necessarily because of Nightmare mode alone, but just the endurance test you have to pass through to beat everything.
Right. Challenge-wise for Nightmare mode itself, I feel like Giants was by far the most brutal, but Swap Force definitely comes close because of the endurance test that comes with it. After having experienced Nightmare mode in each game in the franchise from Giants onwards, which would you say was your favorite to do Nightmare in?
100% Trap Team, honestly. Trap Team before even playing its Nightmare mode was my top favorite of the games, and it still persists even with Nightmare mode. It was challenging and fair, as we've said, and it felt really fun. I'm not the type of player who really aims to play the hardest difficulty. I usually just want to have a more lesser difficulty, balanced, enjoyable time. But this was one where it actually felt something I could sink my teeth into and really enjoy the heck out of it.
I suspected you were going to go with Trap Team, and I figured it was because specifically of the Chaos Doom challenge.
Yeah, that's the that's the biggest thing for sure. How about you, Ditto?
Trap Team really does have a spectacular Nightmare difficulty, but I can't say it was my favorite of the 5. Definitely very much up there. I would probably rank it a close second, but my favorite of them for Nightmare difficulty, I would have to say, was Imaginators, because it let me pick my own difficulty level, essentially. I liked the customizability of being able to basically choose my own level of difficulty within that level of difficulty. I found that I liked that a bit more, just a bit more than I liked the perfect balance that Trap Team struck. Because, well, Trap Team did strike a perfect balance between challenging and fair. Imaginators also offered that same perfect balance, as long as that was the route you chose to take. And I had a lot of fun basically customizing my Nightmare difficulty.
I understand your viewpoint completely on that. And as a side note, it would be interesting, and this of course depends on every individual person, but being able to rank all the Skylanders through Imaginators based on the ease of Nightmare mode for that particular Skylander. I think that would be an interesting thing to see.
That would actually be very, very interesting to see indeed. All that being said, I'm curious to know, those of you listening, what is your favorite game to experience Nightmare difficulty in? And what Skylanders do you prefer to experience it with? What is your top tier Skylander for Nightmare difficulty? I'm curious to know, so let us know in the comments section or on Twitter at SL Portalcasters.
We love to interact with all you Portal Masters out there and keep this community alive, so please hit us up. We're always here to talk.
As we set down the controllers, the Nightmare Challenge completed. We hear a cough immediately behind us, causing us to jump. Turning, we see Hugo standing behind us, watching carefully. "Did I startle you?" he asks, setting his handbook on the table between us.
So calming down after our frightening scare from Hugo, he flips through his handbook through a couple pages until he lands on one with a few attachments by paperclip on them. He pulls them out and shows them to us, and we see that they're scorecards as well as tickets. And there's an old black and white photo with a boxer in a ring standing over a defeated enemy, his fist held high in the air. We realize, oh, we recognize that Skylander. That's Night Shift, the vampire Swap Force Skylander, who will be our focus for this episode's segment, Hugo's Handbook. Night Shift is an undead vampire boxer who is part of the Swap Force, so introduced in Skylanders Swap Force. He has the Swap Force ability of teleport, which he shares with Hootloop, and in my opinion, he is a very unique Skylander, especially within the Swap Force category. His design harkens to vampires and vampire characters, and you can see influences from various incarnations of Dracula as well as a little bit of Nosferatu in his design. But adding the little flair of boxer kind of brings him more than just a generic vampire or creature of the night. It adds a little bit more fun flavor, especially with the skulls on his boxing gloves and his more ethereal, ghastly form, not just being a full physical entity, but being gaseous. He also features a really interesting moveset that puts him in a league of his own, where he can not only deal damage and heal himself, but he also comes with a life system, utilizing baddie coaches, where when upgraded, he can have two at once and essentially have two extra lives when his health is depleted, which is really something else, and we haven't really seen much of it in the games outside of Crash Bandicoot in Imaginators. So Ditto, tell me what you think of Night Shift.
I think Night Shift has a really, really cool design. As you said, vampire boxer, kind of ethereal. Definitely makes for a very interesting design overall. As you said already, the life system was creative and unique, and it was unique to only Night Shift until Imaginators decided to do something similar with Crash Bandicoot. But even then, only two Skylanders have that same type of thing going for them. And that's actually a really, really cool concept, especially in higher level combat. The moveset on Night Shift is actually really fun to use. I would say this is a top tier Skylander very, very easily.
And just have to talk about his gameplay design, just how synergistic it really works. A really good example of a Skylander who feels like his whole design was really well thought out from top to bottom.
It really was, and not only that, it's basically its own sort of multiple characters in one complete design. Because he has that synergy within himself. Not only does he have the life system, but he has super speedy attacks that deal a significant amount of damage. And on top of that, he has attacks that heal him up as well. So he can go from really taking a beating to turning around and dishing it back and healing himself back up from nothing. Or, should he fall, he gets right back up and gets in there. It certainly feels like multiple characters rolled into one in all the best ways.
I'm really having a hard time even just thinking of one fault, or not even a fault, just something to pick at or just point out that could have been done better potentially. But gameplay wise, he's a lot of fun. Even having your soul gem, Gentlemanly, where his attacks do increase damage when he's at full health. Well, how many opportunities he has to be at full health with his damaging but healing moves as well as his reincarnations, essentially. He's just a really well-made Skylander. Even his toy is really cool to look at, with the ethereal parts being sort of that foggy, clear blue plastic material that if you're in a dark room and put on a portal or shine a light behind it, it's going to look that much cooler, like a glowing ghost. The only other thing I can think to mention about him, and it's still a boon for him, is his teleportation ability is just so fast. This could have been an area where they decided to maybe slow that part of him down so you couldn't maybe use it as much. But Night Shift's teleportation, you can bounce around an arena or an area and get in behind enemies or just narrowly dodge an attack. So you're always don't necessarily even have to worry about your health being drained as long as you're very strategic about it.
Yes, the ethereal shift dodge. Because Night Shift is one of the few Skylanders who has a movement ability that allows them to actually dodge through an attack without taking damage.
And that's huge because now it's dodging through an attack. How can you beat that, really? All right, Ditto. So now we come to the moment where we rate this Skylander on a scale of 1 to 7. How would you rate Night Shift?
Based on overall design, combat ability, and how easy he is to utilize, I would give Night Shift a 6 out of 7.
Is there any particular reason? I guess we don't giving perfect scores. That's obvious. It's just, is there any reason why not, I guess?
There isn't anything holding him back, per se, from a perfect score, in my opinion, but while his design is cool and unique, it's just not as outlandish and exciting as I would expect from a perfect Skylander. The colors are still just kind of expected, and for a 7 out of 7 Skylander, you need to have something that really just grabs you.
And I find that is a really fair point. There needs to be that wow factor.
Right.
That je ne sais quoi, that little extra touch. As cool and unique as a vampire boxer is in the overall unlimited world setting that is Skylanders, there's potentially room for him to have a much more outlandish or exciting concept. Is his concept cool as it is? Absolutely. Could it be dressed up more for the world of Skylanders? Why not? So, for the reasons you've stated and that I've previously stated, I'm going to have to be the ditto this time and also give Night Shift a 6 out of 7. So, with that combined rating, Night Shift receives a 6 out of 7 for this segment of Hugo's Handbook. So, with our evaluation in Hugo's Handbook complete, we wave goodbye to Hugo. But as we watch him cross the academy, we are suddenly surprised by a loud boom! We jump in the air and turn around, and there's Flynn laughing at us. What's with everyone trying to scare us this episode? Smirking, Flynn waves us to follow him as he has another destination to take us upon his dread yacht.
Staring off the bow of the dread yacht, this trip seems different from any other we've taken before. We're not soaring above the clouds as we usually would. Instead, there's an eerie feel about this tour as we steer through fog so thick we can't see what's coming ahead of us. We come to an incredibly hard stop against a skyland, and Flynn, playing it off as though he meant to do that, secures the dread yacht to the dock, and we find ourselves in the thick fogs of the Monster Marsh from Skylanders Trap Team. Monster Marsh is the 7th chapter in Skylanders Trap Team, where the Skylander finds themselves in a marshland area chasing down the Doom Raider known as Dreamcatcher. Monster Marsh is also known as the poisonous swamp of bad decisions for many, many reasons. And personally, I feel like coming here in the first place was a bad decision. Trioxen, why don't you go ahead and give your initial thoughts on this Skyland?
Well, I think I have to agree with you that coming to the poisonous swamp of bad decisions was a bad decision. However, I really like spooky things, undead being one of my favorite Skylander elements. And this level I have a mixed relationship with, I think. I really love the overall aesthetic of this level. It's a creepy, almost Universal Monsters, classic Halloween, swampy level. Like, it feels like it was almost taken right from the Wolfman in color. Exploring the graveyards and the swamp are a really fun time for me. And even having enemies who fit the theme fairly well, such as the Ice Scream and the I-5, really add to that nice, creepy, classic Halloween monster vibe.
This level definitely has no end to the spooky.
Absolutely. And it's not even like necessarily traditional monsters that you have to face, like in the previous games where, you might be facing skeletons and spiders. In this case, you're fighting things that launch eyeballs from their mouths or have hands with eyes in them, sort of like from Pan's Labyrinth. It's a very unique kind of spooky, and the eerie music that plays throughout the level itself really helps add to the vibe.
So do the mutant residents, such as Hedwig.
Now, this is a really good opportunity to talk about parts of the level that I think could have used some work. Hedwig, as you mentioned, is a mutant character NPC that you meet in the game, and he does show up later in Trap Team as well. But he's the type of character that has me asking, why did we introduce this guy? He's very... I honestly can't tell really what he is. He has a candle on his head for some particular reason. Maybe it just fits the pun name? I don't know.
It's in his name.
It's in the name. And overall, it just felt like a extra character that didn't feel necessary when we have NPCs from the previous games or elsewhere that could have been a good fill-in for that spot.
At the same time, his design is wildly fitting this area. And then speaking more on designs that are fitting of the area, this particular level also brings us everybody's favorite mimic, Chomp Chest.
Yes, it's always great to see a mimic character enter the battlefield.
I have mixed feelings on mimics as it is from the various RPGs I've played over the years. Chomp Chest is one I'm always happy to see because I just love his design. And he's a lot of fun to fight.
He is a really entertaining villain to face off with. And as you mentioned, his design is just impeccable. The oversized teeth and those little red glowing eyes. It's just, he's borderline adorable, or adorable to some, depending.
And seeing as how they didn't only use the Doom Raiders for refined villains for Imaginators, it's kind of a shame that we didn't get Chomp Chest.
That would have been an incredible, like even to see a Chomp Chest toy on the shelf, just a little mimic treasure chest. I think that would have been pretty great.
That would have been absolutely perfect. I would have loved it so much.
If budget allowed it, if it had a hinge so you could open and close his mouth, that'd be awesome.
Now, my primary thoughts on this level come as a speedrunner, which comes as no surprise to anybody listening, I'm sure.
What?
This level is absolutely a pain to deal with, and, well, it's got great vibes and great atmosphere. The theming is cohesive all the way through. It is perfect in that regard. There are just so many things that slow down a trip through this stage. From the number of scripted enemy fights, to a required game of sky stones, to the poisonous swamp itself, where you have to travel slowly through the swamp with the fairy known as Marcia. Granted, any percent runners will often do what they call the Marcia skip, where they take Chaos and they just sprint off ahead and never even release her from the lamp. But it's a very risky maneuver, and anybody running glitchless wouldn't be doing that. So that area is just a slowdown area that kills your momentum, and it takes forever because it's an auto-scroller.
Yeah, the Marcia guided segment is probably one of my least favorite parts of this stage. I do like the idea of Marcia as a character, however, sort of the goth fairy version of Persephone, but having her be essentially introduced and used only as a guiding lamp safety zone through a very slow and overly drawn out segment is just unfortunate. And the fact that you also don't never see this character show up again or even interact with Persephone, which I think would have been a cool thing to see, just sort of brings the overall feel of the level down, the fun of it.
There is, I believe, a dark gate along the Marcia path, and it's really cool to know that Persephone is not the only fairy in Skylands, but as Trioxen said, I wish they had brought her back more, done something, anything more with her. And that the auto-scroller section that she guides you through wasn't so slow.
Like that could have been a section that they had her fly a little faster, or maybe a different kind of dynamic where you're in an arena and you have to stay under her while fighting enemies to avoid maybe extra damage or something. There's a few different ways this could have gone.
Overall, this level seems to be a mixed bag depending on what you're here for. If you're looking for just a quick adventure through Skylands via speedrun, or just trying to rush through the story to get done and get out of there, this may not be your favorite level, and for good reason. However, if you're here for spooky vibes and to see outlandish creatures and monsters, Monster Marsh is the place for you.
Absolutely. If you're looking to play a collection of Skylanders' spookiest levels, this should be in one of your top 10 list of levels to play.
Having finished up our tour, we rush back to the Dread Yacht just as quickly as we can so we can get out of this spooky area. This swamp has a very foul smell to it, and I don't want to linger. Once on board, we signal to Flynn that we're ready to go, and he hightails it out of there, heading straight for the Archean Arena to meet with Brock to continue our Halloween festivities.
As we touch down and disembark the Dread Yacht, Brock walks over to us and tells us he has an interesting new gadget he wants to try today. From behind his back, he pulls out what looks sort of like a ray gun. He tells us to stand perfectly still as he points it towards us. Not knowing what to expect, we hold our breath. As he fires, things begin to feel a little different. Things are getting bigger. Or, wait, are we getting smaller? Now that we're roughly the size of ants, Brock pulls a glass jar out of his pocket and sets it down right in front of us. A ferocious, skittering, salivating purple insect is rampaging inside, trying as desperately to get out. With a soft chuckle, but to us sounds like a rumbling roar, Brock lifts his foot and gently kicks over the glass bottle. The cork pops off, and the rhino rampage beetle inside charges towards us. So in this segment of Brock's Baddies, Ditto and I are going to be discussing the rhino rampage beetle, which was first introduced in Skylanders Superchargers in the Gadfly Glades world.
Let me just say that this is not a creature I want to see up close without some kind of vehicle to get away from it.
No, absolutely. As small as we are, and it naturally is, we are dwarfed by it without a vehicle. So the Rhino Rampage Beetle is essentially a larger version of the Beetle Bouncer, which, as a shrunken Skylander, is a pretty small enemy to deal with. But the larger Rhino Rampage Beetle, you can't really deal with this easily without a vehicle.
In fact, I don't even think our vehicles were really too effective against it. My methods of dealing with these things were to evade it for as long as I could and watch the collector stomp on them.
Mm-hmm.
They were so terrifyingly strong for what they were that I literally just didn't want to deal with them myself, and I had something else, some other outside force do it for me.
Yeah, I don't know what their armored shells are made out of, but if Chaos could get his hands on that kind of armor for any of his troops, the Skylands might be doomed.
Until the Skylanders produce a large leather boot.
That's true. Master Eon's Mega Boot. Coming soon.
There's not really a lot to be said about the Rhino Rampage Beetle's design. It's a purple beetle with long tusks and glowing orange eyes. And as far as beetles go, I guess it looks pretty cool. As I said earlier, it's pretty terrifyingly powerful, so it's got an intimidation factor to it.
No, absolutely. It's it's a pretty monstrous looking insect, and the fact that usually you're facing off against more than one of them at any given time also adds to the scare factor.
Yeah, that's the really scary part, is that they're never alone.
Mm-hmm. So maybe if you're just facing off against one and you're in your supercharger, it wouldn't be so bad. But the fact that you're probably facing off against three at any given time, that large boot that descends from the sky is really your best friend.
Even the standard go-to of kill it with fire isn't so reliable here.
Yeah, I have a feeling these guys are very comfortable with being fireproof.
On the bright side, they really only have one attack, and it's where they kind of just jab at you, but that's also fairly easy to dodge depending on what kind of movement your vehicle has. If you have a highly maneuverable vehicle, it's really easy to dodge, but there are some vehicles that kind of slowly drift to the side, and those are gonna kind of take some damage here.
Yeah. So as Ditto said, as long as you pick a more maneuverable supercharger, you're gonna be okay. And especially so because for an enemy that has Rampage in the name, these guys don't really rampage as you would expect. When I hear Rampage, I think of stampeding or running and rushing, but these guys kind of they move towards you at a good pace, but it's not like they're quite in a hurry.
Very true.
The Rhino Rampage Beetle is just a terrifying concept and pretty good execution as well. It would just be really cool if we were able to see this in more than the Gadfly Glades area. Or maybe if it were to appear in Imaginators, the aggressiveness and the speed of it would be turned up so they'd be even more of a frightening threat. But that's just my wish list for what could have been for the Rhino Rampage Beetle. But now we are on to the rating of Brock's Baddie. So on a scale of 1 to 7, Ditto, how would you rate the Rhino Rampage Beetle?
I hate to say it, but based on everything we've discussed here, its design, its attack patterns, its threat level, the fact that it's only found here, I'm going to have to give the Rhino Rampage Beetle a 2 out of 7.
Yeah, that's a pretty, fairly low score, but I understand your reasoning completely.
If it had appeared any other location outside the Gadfly Glades as well, and if it was just a little bit higher threat level, that would have definitely turned up my rating by quite a lot. But unfortunately, this is one of those enemies that's kind of not just a one and done, but it's just kind of there. And while they do pose a somewhat imminent threat depending on your difficulty level, while you're facing them down, they don't leave a lasting impression.
Yeah, no, that's 100% fair. They aren't probably the most memorable enemy in all of the Skylanders franchise, that's for sure. But I believe that even with just a few more tweaks, this could have been a real cool enemy that could have been reoccurring and could have created some more interesting memories, especially if there was more ways to take them out rather than trying to rely on a giant boot falling from the sky. And I always do appreciate an insect enemy that does also look fearsome. So I think overall, with everything we discussed, my rating for the Rhino Rampage Beetle is just going to be slightly higher at a 3 out of 7. So with our scores all tallied up, the Rhino Rampage Beetle receives a 2.5 out of 7 for this segment of Brock's Baddies. So as we continue to struggle to take down the Rhino Rampage Beetle, just when we think we can't keep up this fight, the very giant Brock, or regular-sized Brock in our case, reaches down, picks up the beetle in his giant hands, and puts it back in the jar and stows it away. We wave up to Brock to thank him for saving us, but we can see he has a big smirk on his face, and we see his giant boot pulling back. And before we know it, he punts us into the arena down below.
Landing hard in the arena, both Trioxen and I scramble to reach the nearby portals, which is a little more difficult because we haven't been brought back to normal size. And to top things off, the arena seems to be infested with an assortment of insects from the Gadfly Glades. This could make for a very interesting and dangerous situation for both of us, but we also know that Brock just wants a good show, as always, in the Archean arena. Reaching our respective portals, I look to Trioxen and gesture indicating that he should go ahead and summon his champion for today's bout.
Acknowledging Ditto's gesture for me to go ahead and summon my Skylander, I close my eyes and reach my hands out and think deeply of water, but not just any water, boiling water. The portal begins to bubble and spit as boiling water starts seeping over the edge. And then a large horn followed by a couple antennae start rising out of it.
Oh no.
Oh yes. Entering the arena, my Skylander is Lobstar.
Oh, that's bad.
Lobstar is a ranged water Skylander who debuted in Skylanders Trap Team. He has a health of 720, he's critical hit of 60, armor of 29, speed of 55, and a luck of 26. His attacks are his Star Shooter, where he throws his Star Shurikens, and they deal damage of 31. His secondary attack is the Boiling Temper, which deals 21 damage. His attack 3 is the Lobstar Roll, dealing 36. And then for his path options, the top path is the Shooting Star, where while boiled, his stars gain piercing and increased damage. He gains twice the star power, as he's able to release and shoot 2 Traptanium stars at once. And he's able to create more Traptanium stars for protection using Star Defense. For his bottom path, the Boiler, Lobstar will automatically release steam to damage enemies when they hit him, as well as all steam abilities will get stronger and consume less boiling power, so overall the effect lasts longer. And he will leave a trail of damaging steam behind whenever he uses his Lobstar Express, his charging attack. So Ditto, tell me, how do you answer Lobstar's call for battle?
I flee! I stretch my tiny hand over the portal, and focusing all my energy, I tap into the undead element, and I call forth from the swirling mists of the portal, the undead sensei, Chopscotch.
Ooh, I like Chopscotch.
Yeah, she's fun. Chopscotch is an undead melee-style Skylander, with a maximum health at level 20 of 930, critical hit 107, armor 28, speed 65, and luck 29. Her attack 1 is called Chop Chop Chop, and it is a combo attack that brings her axe down, chopping up her enemies for 83 points of damage per hit. Her attack 2 is Spin to Win, which allows her to spin her axe around, knocking enemies back and dealing 48 points of damage per hit. And her attack 3 is called Lose Your Head, which allows her to lob her head at enemies, dealing a whopping 17 points of damage. In this case, her soul gem would also potentially come into play. Her soul gem is Hopscotch, which allows her to use attack 3 while jumping to play a quick game of hopscotch and give her a temporary speed increase. For upgrade options, her top path is known as Heavy Hitter. It allows her to draw in enemies, gives her attack 1 the ability to charge up, and also allows for that charge attack to explode her skulls that are on the ground. Her bottom path is known as Crazy Cutter, which allows for her attack 1 when held to create ranged fissures that deal damage, and allows for her to use a jump attack on a fissure to cause it to explode. Despite being a smasher class, Chopscotch is actually really, really quick with her attacks, and I think that's going to really come into play in this battle. So Trioxen, what kind of strategy would you try to put together for this particular matchup?
Well, it's a really interesting mashup to start with. You have this really fast lobster ninja character facing off against a not bad for speed smasher character, and I am quite intimidated by a lot of Chopscotch's stats in this case, especially being a sensei, as they're quite strong characters to begin with. So I think I have a couple ways I could go about this battle, especially with the swarming insects around us. For starters, if I take Lobstar's shooting star path, I'll be able to create a shield of the Traptanium stars around myself to at least keep the bugs at bay while I deal with the main threat here, which is Chopscotch. Now, in taking that path, my stars do increase in damage, and I can release 2 at once. I think the biggest challenge here is being able to take the time to actually get to a boil and be able to have those increased stats to face off against Chopscotch here. So by taking this path, I think by running around, dodging for the most part, and flinging as many stars while also holding a defensive shield around me would be my best method of attack for this path. As well, if I need to get away in a pinch, I always have the Lobstar Express. And if I am boiled with that, I get to release a Steam Blast afterwards, which would help create at least a safety zone for a little bit in terms of bugs or keeping Chopscotch at bay.
The first thing I would like to note in my strategy is, as I see you set up the Traptanium Star defense, I'm going to take that moment to hopscotch myself to increase my speed. And anytime I see you start to boil, I'm going to get in there and spin to win to knock you back and knock you out of it. One of the key strategies I'm going to run here is I'm going to do everything in my power to prevent Lobstar from boiling.
Yeah, that's my greatest fear there. Because the boiling does take a bit of time just to get it going.
It takes 5 or 6 seconds, especially if you're not on the boiled path. So I would take advantage of that and use the knockback from spin to win to prevent that from ever going up. Because once you're boiled, those stars can do significant damage, and then you become an even greater threat than this already ranged ninja is. Outside of that, the hopscotch being up will help me dodge around the bugs, and I can chop them up as well as I'm chopping towards you. Because as I approach, I want to already be comboing into that damage as well. Just getting up as much damage as I can, as quickly as I can. Because that's really Chopscotch's greatest ability, is her ability to get in there quickly and just chop it up. For my path choice, I think regardless of your path choice, I would go with the Crazy Cutter path, because that allows me to create the Trail of Pain fissures that will deal damage to not just you, but to the surrounding insects. And then if it seems advantageous at any point in time, I can always jump and then attack one of those fissures to cause them all to explode, dealing damage to you, dealing damage to the surrounding insects. And just sticking with the theme and the strategy of getting in, hitting hard and fast, and getting out.
You know, I just saw an interesting opportunity here, especially if I choose Lobstar's boiler path. is that we could sort of end up playing a game of Tron where we both leave trails of damaging attacks behind. Because really, we could spend some time, myself doing the Lobstar Express and leaving steam trails behind, while you leave Trail of Pains behind, and we try and avoid each other's damaging lines. That'd be kind of an interesting one, especially in maybe a more wider arena, and also would help us deal with insects that are trying to swarm us at this time.
I think it really would be an interesting thing to see the steam trails intersecting with the trails of pain and seeing how that works out, especially when I inevitably detonate the trails of pain. The insects surrounding us would then become less of a threat as we clear a bunch of them out, but at the same time, the effect that your steam trails have on me versus the effect that my trails of pain are going to have on you, assuming that we get within range of them, are going to be vastly different. Especially since mine will have a wider range, because if you get just close enough to one and I detonate them, you may not have been close enough for the trail to hit you before, but as it explodes, it's going to deal damage.
So if that's a strategy you go for, Lobstar is really going to have a difficult time just trying to evade while also be on the attack.
Lobstar seems to be at a major disadvantage here outside of range itself. Because if you try to boil, I'm there and you're not going to get there. If you're running steam trails, yes, you may do some damage with those, but my trails are bigger and better. So Lobstar does seem to be running at a disadvantage, except that he can hit from a larger distance. However, he can only fire off 2 attacks at once before having to wait for those stars to return. So it would have to be very strategically played, trying to essentially nightmare mode your way around Shopscotch.
Yeah, it feels like it's going to be an uphill battle. Is it doable? Potentially. If Lobstar can get a steam in, he's probably off to the races for a good chunk of that battle.
It's definitely doable, and if Lobstar does manage to somehow miraculously get a boil up, it's definitely more than just possible. It's definitely doable. But from even starting ground, it's an uphill battle all the way for Lobstar. That's what the numbers are showing here. That's what the numbers are looking like to me.
No, and absolutely I agree with you in this case. And in our current circumstances, being surrounded by insects, that actually might be one of the things that would have to help me to my advantage, having environmental threats distracting you potentially so Lobstar can get all steamed up. But if this was a regular 1v1 without any distraction, I'm leaning towards Chopscotch taking it probably 9 times out of 10.
Once again, it comes down to Portal Master skill level and how the battle is played. This does seem to be a very one-sided match, even with the area hazards of these insects that we've got all over the arena, assuming that we're both taking damage at an equal rate from them, or even giving that Chopscotch is the only one getting distracted by them. A simple spin to win, clearing out a few of them, giving just enough room to start running again. The insects are going to be more of a minor hindrance in this case than they otherwise would be. The biggest thing is the insects could allow for Lobstar to get boiled without Chopscotch being able to interfere in time. And that would be the hope on Lobstar's side for this. So with the field hazards included, I'm going to rule that Chopscotch would take this 6 times out of 10 on average, whereas in a one-on-one match with no additional field hazards, Chopscotch would take this 9 times out of 10. Meaning that today's Archean Arena champion is none other than Chopscotch.
A well-deserved win.
As the dust clears after our epic bout, Brock smiles down at us, happy with the battle we just had. He fires his device at us once again, returning us to normal size. The arena still being infested with insects, we make a hasty retreat back towards the Dread Yacht, where we can sit in comfort and listen to the troll radio. Take us away, Chill Bill.
That concludes this episode of Skylanders Portalcasters. You'll find the website and links to the hosts' individual channels in the description. Follow the Skylanders Portalcasters Twitter for regular updates about this podcast. And join Discord server for Skylanders discussion. Until next time, this is Chill Bill with K-Troll signing off.
Guess that's what we get for giving his baddie a 2.
They all can't be winners, Brock. How can you beat that, really?
By being Magna Charge?
Well, okay. You know, we all can't be perfect like Magna Charge.
Right.
But we could do our best.